So we're in the final session before we come to the conclusions, and I'm very, very happy. And I think it's a very important session, given also the situation of the world today. As Vera already said, it's on human rights, borders, and conflicts. And I'm very happy to have here with me in Geneva, Jelena Aparac, who's here as an independent researcher, and she will introduce herself further in a minute. And then online, we have Elio Panese of Border Forensics with us, and Erika Harper of the Geneva Academy. So welcome to all of you. And maybe because you're here with me, I would like to start with you and ask you to please present yourself and also the work that you carry out with regard to the question of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for inviting me. I have experience. So my name is Jelena Aparac, and I have experience as a humanitarian worker. I was a former expert with the UN Working Group on the use of mercenaries, and I currently hold a position with the NGO that brings legal strategic litigation for victims of armed conflicts. I will, however, speak on my own behalf today, because I also work on issues such as business and human rights and armed conflicts, and I published on this topic quite extensively. A few publications coming still out. Shall I just dig into the business and human rights directly, or shall I?
Yeah, maybe we do that when everyone has introduced herself or himself. So maybe Erika, you could go ahead on just briefly introducing yourself, and then we start discussing.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's all good.
Yep. So my name is Erika Harper. I'm the head of research and policy studies at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. As the name suggests, we work on international humanitarian law and human rights issues, but some things we're particularly interested in with respect to this topic, we work on climate security, we work on the institutional reform of the peace and security architecture, and particularly the role of the Human Rights Council within that. And then we work on non-state actors, including private military and security actors and non-state armed groups. So I'm going to be talking today. I thought the best thing for me to talk about today was the evolving role of the Human Rights Council within that conflict, peace and security architecture, and how it is evolving to fill some of the gaps that are being left, as we can see in the crises today. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And Elio, maybe you can also continue to introduce yourself, and then maybe also start digging deeper into your work on your experience on the human rights sector, and also maybe describe a bit how the Human Rights Declaration that all this event was all about is influencing your work still today.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me properly? That's good.
Yeah, it's all good.
Thank you. So my name is Elio Panese, and I'm a researcher for the NGO based in Geneva called Border Forensics. So Border Forensics is an NGO that develops and uses spatial and visual research and analysis methods to investigate border violence wherever it materializes. So we work in collaboration with migrant people and non-governmental groups to reconstruct with precision specific cases of human rights violation, while also rendering the tools that we develop and that we use, rendering those tools available so that they can be used by other human rights actors. So in that sense, we aim to provide, on the one hand, an external capacity to civil society actors by conducting investigations in collaboration with them, and also at the request of them sometimes, while also strengthening their internal capacity of collecting proofs and applying methods to investigate human rights violation. So in this sense, human rights is really at the core of our practice. And maybe just to develop this a little bit, we can say that Border Forensics operates at the intersection of 4 different fields. So we have the field of human rights, we have the research, the art and architecture, and we can develop a bit on this also, and technologies. And so each of the activities in this area are mutually reinforcing. And so in our human rights work, we produce evidence of violation using those tools that I mentioned earlier, and different strategies derived from forensic science, architecture, investigative journalism, and NGO practices. And so we also develop different technologies to develop practical tools and know how to understand how acts of violence work and how to appropriate some of these technologies. And research also is really central to our practice because it really enables us to situate those forms of violence that we study in the wider political, social, ethical context and the different social, historical aspects of the border and the state policies and practices. And finally, arts and architecture-based strategies really provides us with crucial means of visual and spatial analysis, as well as the language needed to think critically about the aesthetics of our findings in order to communicate them to a wider public. In this sense, we develop reports, but also visualization that are used in legal, national and international courts, but also more broadly in cultural events or political assemblies in order to also raise awareness and render visible the forms of violence that we study. And so at the same time, it's good to mention that human rights, as I said, is at the core of our practice, but also our work is really takes its roots in a broader historical moment and approach in human rights practice that some have described, for example, as Eyal Weizman has described as the forensic turn in human rights practice. So in the sense, this emerging sensitivity to material investigation traces and this continuous shift from human rights practice mainly focused on victims' testimonies to one that also mobilizes an extremely wide range of material evidence to present them in legal forum to hold actors accountable for their actions. And so in general, we also really think critically about this human rights practice, human rights approach, because not only on the data we use and the tools that we develop, but also this forensic turn can also be quite problematic in the sense that it's also related to the fragility and the sometimes discredited testimony of victim. And so we also, while developing tools to analyze material evidence, we also put at the center of our practice the victim's testimony to ensure that their voices is not only heard but also heard and put at the center of the investigations as well.
Thanks a lot, Elio. And I already noted down some of the aspects that you mentioned that we should then later on continue to discuss further, maybe. But Erica, could you please dig a bit deeper into your work, like particularly the one on the peace and security architecture, your findings with regard to the Human Rights Council? Could you just elaborate a bit more on that, please?
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about some research that we've been doing in collaboration with the United Nations University and the Human Rights Council. And it's really been, unpacking and examining the evolving role of human rights in conflict prevention, early warning, and mitigation. So is it okay if I talk for about kind of 7-ish minutes, and I'll just kind of present where we are with the research, and then I can answer some questions? Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit and give a bit of context on the traditional architecture as a whole, what it can do, what it can't, how it's changing, and then kind of look at how actors like the Human Rights Council might fit into this. That's kind of the remit of the research. Current context, it's obviously incredibly difficult to ignore. And while we've had complaints about the Security Council's responsivity for decades, the system seems to be operating with, particular ineffectiveness at the moment. 18 months ago, we saw one member state invade its neighbour Ukraine, and because that member is part of the Permanent Five, the tools at the Council's disposal, they've been rendered fairly useless. And the situation is also interesting because it demonstrates that the veto isn't the only problem. So these geopolitical divisions, they run really deep and they carry over to the General Assembly. Its strongest act has arguably been suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council. And look, even then, the sponsors of the resolution, they had to work really hard, like harder than they expected, to get those 2/3 votes needed. Events in Gaza, they can likewise be looked at as a failure of the international peace and security architecture. There's no justifying of Hamas's acts, but the situation also needs to be viewed in context. So, Gaza's been occupied since 1967. There's been a land, sea, air blockade since 2007. There have been settlements built. This has all been in contravention of international law. This was the 5th largest military offensive in 15 years. I lived in the Middle East for 2 of those. And these are all key drivers of instability and conflict in the region. And despite all of this, again, we see that the Security Council has struggled to take on, the violations that are, even completely uncontested from a legal perspective. And again, this is largely because of one member state exercising its veto. So, geopolitical divisions, especially among the P5, is a major issue in how we look at the architecture today. The council was set up at a different time, responding to a certain set of logic and events that, no longer speak to representativeness by any standard. But look, changing this is going to be tough. The power that would have to be given up, it's just too great. At the same time, lamenting that the peace and security architecture is completely broken, is probably an overstatement. It's certainly not constructive. So one thing we need to acknowledge is that, against all these struggles, there are still and will continue to be issues that the council can come together on. Its response to the Islamic State group is a good example. So in the 3 years that the group was most active, the council operated kind of pretty much as we would have wanted it to. Passed about 12 resolutions. The High Commissioner on Human Rights was able to brief members in formal session. Findings from the OHCHR investigatory mission, they were incorporated into subsequent resolutions. Now, of course, what allowed this was context. It was a shared threat to the international community without any vested member state involvement. But this doesn't, this doesn't make what it did do any less valuable. And if we look forward, especially given the risks that are, posed by artificial intelligence and climate change, threats of a similar nature may become more frequent. So we still need the council. Another point that came out of the research that we need to acknowledge is that the system as a whole is not static. So it has component parts that are evolving and reconfiguring themselves to deal with blockages, to debate and to action. And this is possible because while the council might have primary responsibility for peace and security, it's not solely responsible. And this is where the role of the HRC becomes interesting. And if we kind of look at this historically, we can see that, this maneuvering is the outcome of kind of a decades-long process of contestation and adjustment where every so often the lines of responsibility between the council and the Human Rights Council and other organs have become a little bit more dispersed. So one of those most important moments was probably in 1950 with Resolution 377, what we talk about as uniting for peace now. It fell shy of authorising the General Assembly to take forceful measures, but it did make clear that the power of the council is not inviolable. The last 10 years, we can see this other evolution. So in this growing willingness of the Human Rights Council to step into this space. It may not be a peace and security actor, but it can undertake peace and security kind of esque actions. We've seen this in its creation of country-specific special rapporteur. It also is increasingly mandating investigatory mechanisms. And while neither of these involve the use of force, we shouldn't underestimate them. So in a conflict theatre, I think any fact-gathering process, it confers a message that at some point in the future, perpetrators of IHL or IHRL may be brought to account. And in really complicated situations like Ukraine, this may be the only tool which we have as an international community to influence belligerency in a real-time manner. So if we step back, I think rather than a completely broken and stagnant system, it might be more constructive to understand today's peace and security architecture as moving, as chameleon. It has the capacity to take different forms at different moments. So when conditions are right, the council can act swiftly, but purposefully, and we will need it to do so in the future. But when politics kind of brings that system to a halt, we can see other organs creatively using their flexibility and their competency to bridge gaps. It's not perfect. The Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, they're of course not immune from blockages, and their toolkit is more limited, but it's also not all bad. So given that the one kind of consistent thing about conflicts is that they have political dimensions, a playing field that's got multiple stakeholders, each bearing different tools and working methods, it means that we have greater scope for dealing with threats. And this is really important. It may be that, the best way to encourage the Permanent Five at the Security Council to get serious about reform that's actionable and that's fair is to gently signal back to them that unless they do, new players like the HRC are going to come in and fill those voids. In terms of what we can do now to kind of support the Human Rights Council and the notion of human rights as a peace and security prevention mechanism, we set out a number of recommendations in our research. Anyone who's interested can go on the Geneva Academy website and download it. I think the most important that we wanted to reiterate is understanding how to support this evolving context without derailing it or interrupting it. So, for example, I mentioned this really steep increase in Human Rights Council mandated investigations and their potential utility, especially when all other avenues are blocked. But we really don't know a lot about how these work in granular terms, especially how and in what contexts and taking what forms these investigations might serve a prevention function, prevention of human rights violations, prevention of conflict escalation. So we need more research here to kind of find out what particular elements we need to be strengthening. A second point is that discussions around reforming the peace and security architecture, they really need to incorporate these evolutions and these new players. So one reform proposal that's recently resurfaced is around a code of conduct whereby permanent members of the Security Council would not use their veto in situations where there was credible evidence of IHL or large-scale human rights violations. The time wasn't right for this to get traction in 2015 when it was first proposed. It's certainly not the right time now, but it is a sound proposition, and we could consider variations on this, like such instances triggering a debate, an emergency debate at the Human Rights Council. Last point I'll say is that we need to support positive steps forward. And in doing that, we really need to learn from the past. So pushing for too much in terms of new players and their capabilities too soon, it can backfire. This is the lesson that we have to learn from the way that responsibility to protect R2P was invoked in Libya. Many member states are highly uncomfortable with particularly the Human Rights Council getting involved in peace and security matters. And some of this reasoning is valid. So the path needs to be navigated carefully, and boundaries, especially anything that could be construed as a pretext for interfering in domestic affairs unnecessarily, needs not to be overstepped. So that's basically where our research stands at the moment, and we're going into a next phase in 2024, and happy to answer any questions on the paper or on this, what the next phase of our research might look like. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erica. And we will dig deeper into it afterwards, but I would like to give Jelena the chance now to explore more of her work on business and human rights and conflict. And yeah, I'm very curious to find out about it.
Thank you. Actually, the times are really very striking to demonstrate how much do we actually need to look more into the substance of what we can do in terms of accountability and holding companies responsible for their actions, not just in armed conflict, but as the title of this workshop rightly points, also on the border management and migration. And I'll come to later to that, maybe to connect the first to intervention, because I think it's a very interesting point, in particular if you focus on the role of companies. But yes, the question of wars and economy dates from prehistorical times. It's not something that is new. We have the issue of companies being involved and to some extent hold accountable during the first war tribunals since Nuremberg trials in the UN system. So the political process also dates since the 1970s and the first Cassese report for the role of companies in the Chile dictatorship, and it has been very active ever since. So there is a conscience from both human rights policy and international criminal law perspective, the need to look into the roles of companies and to hold them actually to accountable. We are failing more today than a few decades ago, if I may say so. And we are failing for several reasons. Companies are being more increasingly multinational in their forms. They are increasingly participating in the processes. And we have a system today that is very contradictory in itself. What does it mean concretely? It means that international public law is very much state-centric. So we say states are the only ones who have obligations under international law. Companies cannot have obligations under international law, therefore they could not be held accountable. And yet we find ourselves before European Court of Human Rights, where companies that are not human can initiate proceedings to have their human rights being defended, while at the same time, before the same court, individuals cannot come and claim their human rights being protected against those same companies. That is one of the paradoxes. At the same time, we say companies don't have responsibility under international because they don't have international obligations, and we cannot state cannot turn against companies. But we have proceedings before International Investment Center for Investment Disputes, where companies can go against states, and very often multinational companies go very often against small states that are economically very unfavorable. So we live in a system of paradoxes where those companies have more and more power, they have more and more access to policy-making decisions, they have more and more access to accountability to defend their rights, whether in the economic system or now a human rights system. And yet there is still nothing that can be used in this system to hold them accountable. This is true and this is false at the same time, because international law can actually hold them accountable if there would be more will to do so. And specifically, International Criminal Court can prosecute corporate directors. There have been quite a lot of communications under Article 15 of the Rome Statute to initiate and to trigger those proceedings. And to this day, this has never happened. Even at the beginning of the International Criminal Court, one of the first press releases of the very first prosecutor relating to the situation in Congo was to say, we are going to look into potentially prosecute white-collar crime, meaning the role of corporations in the situation of Congo that we know is very much related and stimulated by economic interest of various companies, but it has never happened to this day. So the system itself not just from the peace and security structure, but from the accountability structure as well, needs to be rethink, and it needs to be rethink in a way that has a more equal approach, not to defend, as it does now, Western and powerful states, but to have more equilibrium, more equal approach to give power and voices to the states from the what we call global South today, and this is a growing interest also from the global South countries themselves.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, maybe we go back to Elio for a while, and yeah, I've heard a lot about the way you try to make your findings visible, also in order to mobilize people, to represent people. So maybe you can talk a bit about the instruments, a bit more about the instruments that you use in order to overcome the current situations of human rights abuses. Also, maybe with regard to obstacles in general that are there in terms of holding states accountable for their human rights obligations.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe so that everything that I said before is maybe a bit clearer as well. Let me give you an overview of our work as well, and for example, the 3 last investigations that we published. So border forensics focus on different border regions of the world. Recently, we published 3 investigations, one on the border, on the situation in the Alps between Italy and France, another situation in the Mediterranean, another one in the Sahel-Sahara region in the borders of Niger. And so the different investigation, the first one we published in May 2022 was the death of Blessing Matthew. Blessing Matthew was a Nigerian woman who tried to cross the Alps from Italy to France, and when she arrived in the French part of the border, she was chased by the French police and ended up falling or being pushed in a river, in the Durance River. And so we developed spatial temporal reconstruction in order to assess the unfolding of the events and located the different events in a 3D environment. And we managed in this situation to show the contradiction of the police testimonies on this case. For this case, we worked in collaboration with the Association Tous Migrants, who tried to reopen the case in the French court because this case was really quickly closed by a French prosecutor. And in this situation, until now, the case was still not reopened for, something we can discuss maybe in detail also later for issues related to the acceptability of proof in different legal settings. Another investigation that we did was on the impact of Frontex surveillance in the Mediterranean and the impact of the Frontex drone surveillance and their role in the interception of boats by the Libyan Coast Guards. And the idea of this investigation was to render visible the invisible drones and to unveil the aerial complicity of Frontex in abuses that are happening in Libya, while accounting for the responsibility that should come with the surveillance capacity of Frontex. And the latest investigation that we published was on the deadly effects of border control in Niger, focusing specifically on the law that was actually abrogated last week, if I'm not mistaken. And so through the development of geostatistical methods, we measured the impact of border control on the changing tracks used by migrants in the Sahara side region, and to monitor the increased risk of dying of dehydration that this entails. And so by using satellite imagery, we documented shifting tracks over time, and to rendered visible the deadly impact of border control. So these different investigations, mainly for the blessing investigation, were used. The blessing investigation, for example, the report was used to push for the reopening of a case in the French court, but others were more diffused in different forums. So mainly cultural forums where we develop also exhibitions, and which led also to talks and discussion around those cases and the deadly effects of border control in general. But maybe to answer your question more precisely, it's interesting to focus on an ongoing investigation that we are conducting much closer to Geneva, actually, here in Switzerland. We have been called upon a non-governmental actor, an association in Switzerland, to investigate a case of racist police violence here in Switzerland. Back in 2021, Roger Enzo Willem, a Swiss man of South African descent, was killed by a police officer in Morges train station. So Morges is a town between Geneva and Lausanne. And the investigation on his death was led by the public ministry of the Canton Vaud, and still more than 2 years after his death, hasn't arrived to shed light on the exact unfolding of the event. So we undertook a counter investigation on this case, and we already published some preliminary elements of analysis on this case, but our investigation is still ongoing. But here it clearly shows the difficulty to investigate those cases also here in Switzerland, mainly on the one hand, some obstacles regarding the access to different means of proof. For example, it is the public ministry who holds the different proof and who gathered and provide the different means of proof. And what we were able to show is that some means of proof were actually missing in the file report. And at the same time, it also showed the different obstacles and also a continuum of violence that is put on the victims, but also on their families while they're seeking justice. Here, it's good to mention the report on the visit to Switzerland of the working group of experts on people of African descent. They visited Switzerland in 2022 and really pointed out that Switzerland, although Switzerland has ratified all major international human rights treaty, it has a monist tradition. So the major human rights law are implemented in our constitution and legal system. But Switzerland still has a weak legal and practical means to combat racism, discrimination, and to seek justice when human rights violations human rights are violated. And so what we see here is that we try to do with border forensics is try to shed light on the different human rights violations that we are investigating on, and at the same time to overcome the negation of rights and also sometimes the negation of violence that is quite symptomatic of those cases, especially when talking about police violence, especially when those cases are concerning people of African descent. And something, maybe the last thing that is also important to mention here with regard to human rights and also recommendation related to human rights defense in Switzerland, is that although this report and others pointed out the critical lack of legal and practical means to combat, for example, racism, but also human rights violation, Switzerland also has largely ignored the different UN recommendations that were put forward in the different reports. And so it's also the work of Border Forensics, but also many other human rights organizations here in Switzerland to render visible this lack of accountability and to try and put forward for a better practice and better legal and practical framework to combat racial discrimination, to combat human rights violation here in Switzerland.
Thanks a lot, Elio, also for these very concrete examples, which I think help to understand your work better, but also to understand what kind of situation of crisis we are talking about. Erika, maybe you've been talking also about lessons from the past that we should draw. Maybe I could ask you to to elaborate a bit more on those lessons that you have already drawn, and also specifically with regard to how human rights could in the future help to better prevent conflicts or situation of crisis, and build more resilience. I'm sure you have some examples to
I mean, in terms of lessons from the past, I mean, the main one that keeps seeming to be repeated is again pushing for too much too soon. Again, there are very valid reasons why there is concern about too much informational exchange or cooperation between the security kind of geared organs of the systems and the human rights geared organs of the system. And that's mainly about the politicization of human rights issues, and conversely applying human rights kind of intervention strategies as a means of furthering geopolitically based agendas. So we really need to be careful about that. I think another lesson from the past is that just because an idea didn't work at the time, it doesn't mean we should completely, just put it in the bin and forget about it. Context matters and moments matter, and what was not possible 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, might suddenly be possible again. So moments matters in social sciences. We call them kind of critical junctures. So we need, it's not a very satisfying solution. It doesn't fit really well into a work plan or a log frame, but we need to be quite flexible when we look at peace and security architecture reform, and wait for those key moments, and then have a kind of a toolbox of ideas on how we could push the system forward in small but positive ways. In terms of, I think your second question was around the role that human rights could play moving forward in conflict prevention. So when the Human Rights Council was set up, it was against a backdrop of this increasing realization that there were these interconnections and mutually constituting relationship between human rights violations and conflict, and part of how that manifested was looking at the Human Rights Council as having an early warning and a prevention mandate. And I think there's kind of a lot of enthusiasm for this in the system, and the idea, like, it's very logical, this idea that the Human Rights Council has all of these mechanisms, treaty bodies, special procedures, the Universal Periodic Review, and so it's got all this capacity to monitor compliance and violations of human rights practice, and this can that tracking function, it can monitor where risk factors lies that could spill over into conflict, and because it's got this capacity, it can intervene in a timely manner to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think a lot of that support has kind of yielded to criticism that the Human Rights Council isn't playing that role very effectively, and it's really not a fair comment, because if you kind of unpack the mechanics behind which the Human Rights Council is meant to do this, it goes into kind of, special procedures is a good example. I think we kind of critics might look at, this huge body of reporting and information which is produced by all the country and the thematic mandates, and they kind of think that, if only this could be kind of brought together and synthesized and analyzed, like in there must somehow, somewhere be the key to unlocking prevention, and if we could just get that right. In reality, we have to look at the way that the special procedures has been constructed, and they're independent experts that are by design able to follow their own agenda, and that means that, and they're resource limited as well. So we're never going to get a comprehensive, granular understanding of how human rights violations might be spilling over into conflict everywhere at all times in all dimensions. It's just not realistic to expect that of the system. So I think either, I mean, we could do a better job, I think, at pooling and synthesizing the information that's collected under special procedures. But, you know, if we really wanted the council to play a prevention role, then we have to enable it to do that. So instead of complaining about why it's not doing it, we have to understand that, you know, the system just isn't currently set up. The mechanics of the system isn't set up to produce the kind of information in a granular and timely way that we could react to it. And then we also have to take into account that, look, at the end of the day, the HRC, it's a member state intergovernmental body. Like it or not, these fora will be prone to politicization. It might not be quite as apparent and acute as in some of the other organs, but it is still going to be there. So I think we have to be realistic about what we aim for, and then when we want to aim for something, we have to be willing to put the tools and resources and energy behind it to see it home. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks a lot, Erica. And I like that positive notion that you that you tend to have in all the criticism of the system as it is right now. Yeah, I would like to give you, Jelena, the chance to explore a bit more, like about the instruments that there maybe are in place in order to make the companies, businesses more accountable. Like, how could we use the human rights and all its architecture in order to overcome this impunity that there is in place right now?
Talking about challenges. Well, maybe I'll try to connect the border issue and the war issue as of the title, and maybe to come back some of the things that Erica mentioned, and in particular the role of special procedures, as I was the member of the working group on the use of mercenaries that also has a mandate of a very particular type of companies, which is private military and security companies. And as a working group, we presented the reports to both Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. And we worked a lot because of the nature of our mandate on the issues of contemporary armed conflicts. And in that sense, we very often found, most of our findings, in fact, are that more private military and security companies are present in armed conflict, more likely is that conflict will be intense and long-lasting, because clearly there is the interest, economic interest that is behind the motivation of those companies to be involved in the first place. And I'm not talking just about private military and security companies in a very strict sense. We have a very broad definition, and we comprise also the military industry and armament industry. And we see how armament industry is now profiting from both conflicts that are very, very actual right now. We're talking about Ukraine, Russia, and then Gaza situation and Israel intervention. So companies are very much involved in those. But then coming back to the borders, I think that's something that is less known in terms of the private military and security companies involving. We did a report in 2020 on the role of private military and security companies in border management and migrant detention centers. And we found that this is a multi-billion dollar industry. And when we take into consideration that migration is only going to increase due to the wars, to the climate change, to many other factors, we can see that there is a huge interest by those companies, for those companies, to lobby with different policies at different levels, be that EU, international organizations, states, to present migration as something that is very dangerous, that is very complex, that states don't have enough technology and tools to tackle that. And we see them intervening into these issues. And from what can be done, to come back to your question, we as special procedure mandate experts, and I'm no longer with the working group, but I'm very glad that my colleagues continue in the excellent work and very engaged work, can act through the system of allegation letters. When we receive information by victims representative, or whoever may have relevant information, to raise the issue, to bring it to the attention to the experts, who then bring that to relevant state. And what is extremely important, and we have done that a lot during my mandate for sure, is to also bring those allegation letters to non-state actors, such as companies, but also armed groups. And at the current international architecture of accountability between international tribunals, human rights mechanism, and all that, special procedures are the only ones who actually, through the very light formats, can hold non-state actors, such as companies, to a certain extent accountable. At least it's not really accountability system, but at least to raise the issues and to say this is wrong, and you have some human rights obligations and responsibilities. So that's one thing, and one tool that is currently the only tool at the international, and it should be used. And victims representatives should use this system, because it's really important, because then it can be used at the national level in domestic prosecutions to support domestic proceedings as much as is possible. The second tool that I would say is people themselves. Now, I like to remind people that the UN Charter starts with the people, and it's the only time when we hear the word people. And the rest of the UN Charter addresses to states and talks about states. But it means, it's very symbolic to start the UN Charter with "we the people," because it is for the people that the whole system is actually being created for. States are the tools that should defend people's interests and work for their own people and other people. Yes, we have some articles that say that states have obligation towards other people as well, right? But it is for the people. And who else, right? And we have the experience that we've seen in different thematic issues, or in different voting proceedings in the Human Rights Council, or when we mobilize for arms treaty, that when people is invested in the process, when the civil society is invested, they are pushing, they are actively engaged in it, they raise their voice, then we actually can get to reform the system to different levels on different topics. We can actually get to have some success, and states actually are obliged to react. And when there is no civil society, and right now a PMC treaty, the treaty that is being negotiated on private military and security companies, there is not even 3 civil society organizations in it participating in discussions in the room, then we see that it's really difficult to run the process. So I would say engagement of civil society is very important. And thirdly, and I'll end with that, we need to decolonize our discourse and discussions. Wherever I go, be that in Geneva, or I just came from New York from the Assembly of State Party, I see people full of Western experts, Western lawyers. Very little people come from experts or lawyers from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America. We need to globalize discussions. We need to hear all the voices equally. Discussions should represent different regions, and different regions should be involved in those discussions. And so we need to find a way to have the global discourse, not the Western discourse, and to give the global South also the voice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jelena. Yeah, that's actually a good starting point from to the last round of discussion that I think we can have, because we only have a couple of minutes left, but I would like to give everyone the chance. And maybe building on that, what you've just said, like both with regard to referring to the necessary engagement of civil society in all these processes, but also the globalization of voices, which we also try to do in this 24-hour format a bit. Like, I mean, we only reached out to about 80 participants this time, because 24 hours are also limited, but it's at least like an effort that we make to really also include like people from all over the place, also because of the 24-hour format that's more possible than with other discussions that we organize. So all of you, maybe Erica can start this time. What do you think? What needs to be done in order to organize civil society better, to mobilize in the name of human rights? Maybe just a couple of ideas that come up to your mind, also with regard to the topics that you talked about before.
Maybe I'll just say that, and again, kind of trying to look on the positive side of things, rather than coming up with new ideas, there's a bunch of stuff that we could quite easily fix in the existing system or build upon to make better. Going back to special procedures, one of the really unique and evaluating things about them is that they've got this, formal and protected communication channel with civil society. The individuals can directly approach the special procedure. It can do call for inputs, and this is really unique. And I think one thing that is criticised of special procedures is that there's a lot of espousing of views or espousing of criticism without drawing in concrete recommendations for how to make a situation better. And that linked to people on the ground, affected communities, civil society organisations, they often have the answers. And so one thing that could pretty quickly and easily be fixed is special procedures kind of drawing into their advocacy, their very important advocacy on these voices, on not just what the problems are, but also how they might be fixed. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Elio, maybe you have some ideas on that as well.
Yeah, to follow, I agree with what has been said so far. The necessity to ensure that the voices of affected communities and the civil society organization are heard at all the different level, whether now we're talking at the international level, but also at the national level, is essential. And coming back to what I said in the introductory parts of this discussion, strengthening civil society is more than a catchword. It's really something that needs to be implemented willingly and thoughtfully, in the sense of giving tools and ensuring that the capabilities of people are developed, and that's what also with Border Friends is where we try to do. So I would say, yeah, developing and strengthening the civil society organization, and at the same time also ensuring that within civil society bridges are built between organizations in order to be stronger together, with a bigger collaboration between the different organizations within the civil society working on similar but also different domains.
Thanks a lot. Jelena, you have a final thought and also the final word of this round then.
Well, okay, yes. Just to raise one of my concerns, and I'm sure I'm absolutely not the only one, but we are living, as you know, in challenging times, and one particular challenge is the shrinking space of civil society, be that human rights organizations, human rights defenders, or humanitarian organizations, as we are seeing in current situations around the world. So the civil society is actually being pulled between, giving support to those who really need the victims and civilians around the world, and on the other hand, defending themselves, being victims of different systems and attacks on civic space and freedom of expression and freedom of manifestation. So that is something that we really need to be careful about. We need to take this into account, and we need to also ensure that civic space is protected wherever that is in the global north, as we've seen it also in terms of manifestations for Gaza, but also in the global south against extractive companies, for freedom of speech in conflict zones. So civic space really needs to be protected. And we have that responsibility to ensure and to raise our voices for all of them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to the three of you. I think we should continue this conversation at some point, and yeah, and it was great also to have these three different angles on the same problems, more or less. So thanks a lot to the three of you, and I think now before the closing panel, we will still have a video of one of our partners, actually, Laura van Waas, the co-founder of the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion, who could not join us today on the discussion, but she recorded her thoughts on the topics, and we will have that video while we prepare for the closing session. Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Laura van Waas, and I am a co-founder and a co-director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. I am speaking to you today from the Netherlands, but my organization works on this issue all around the world, and it's a real pleasure to connect to all of you wherever you're dialing in from. We're really pleased to be participating in this event to mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The focus of our work is actually all around Article 15 of the Declaration, that everyone has the right to a nationality. The right to nationality became embedded in international law through the Universal Declaration, and it has since been reaffirmed across a multitude of UN human rights treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW Convention, and others. And it also exists in regional human rights instruments and has become an area with really exciting case law emerging over the last few years, where people have actually been able to assert their right to a nationality in courts and before international human rights bodies. And yet you may not know all that much about this issue. Essentially, where someone's right to nationality has been most severely violated, this can leave them without any nationality at all. It can make a person stateless. Statelessness is not a very well-known issue, but it is a global one, and it's a very important one. As we will find out as we talk through this session today, it can have a real impact on the enjoyment of other human rights as well. My organization, ISI, was set up 9 years ago because there was no NGO working at the global level that was fully dedicated to promoting the right to nationality and working with stateless people to ensure that they could enjoy their other human rights. A big part of our work from the very beginning was to raise the profile of statelessness as a human rights issue and make sure that it could gain its place on the global human rights agenda. This has meant doing a lot of advocacy, in particular with Geneva-based institutions. So we've worked with partners in over 100 different countries to make submissions to the Universal Periodic Review. And we've also helped to evaluate the outcome of the review process by looking at recommendations. And we in fact created a database that allows people to explore the recommendations made from the UPR and from other bodies on statelessness and nationality. We've also engaged with treaty bodies like the Committee on the Rights of the Child and others. And we helped to inform a very exciting new Human Rights Council resolution that was adopted just in June that deals specifically with the right to nationality and how it intersects with different forms of discrimination. One of the things that we do is to look at how statelessness actually intersects with other human rights in order to promote a better understanding of the statelessness specific challenges that exist, but also how these can be solved. So for this presentation, as part of this event, we thought it would be nice to zoom in on one of these nexus areas. And we have chosen to look at the nexus between statelessness and the right to education, which is also protected in the Universal Declaration. I've invited my colleague, Deneisha Moss, who leads our knowledge building and our children's work, to join me for a conversation about a global initiative that we've been coordinating that just wrapped up a few days ago, an awareness month on childhood statelessness and education. So, Deneisha, thank you for joining me for this event. Maybe we can kick things off with you introducing yourself and explaining briefly about how statelessness creates barriers for children's right to education.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all of our listeners and watchers from wherever you may be watching this. I am Deneisha Moss, and as Laura indicated, I lead the children's work at ISI as well as the knowledge building program. Laura, to answer your question on how statelessness impacts children's right to education, there are in fact a number of barriers that have been identified that effectively stop children from enjoying their right to education. Among those barriers, for example, we know that where children have lack of legal status in a country, no matter whether they may be born in that country, those children often find difficulty to access education where, for example, a state has put in place mechanisms or a system where non-citizen children do not have automatic access to formal education. We've also seen stateless children suffer impact or are impacted where, for example, there are structural barriers. So in effect, there may be a situation where although a state may effectively allow for access to education for all children, but in practice, many children within the states or within that territory may not hold the necessary proof of identity or documentation to be able to register for school. So in that context, whereas there may not be a clear discrimination against non-citizen children, effectively children who don't have proof of identity or children who may be undocumented or may not hold a birth certificate also, in fact, face challenges to go to school. There are other instances as well where stateless families are often those who live on the margins of society. And what that means effectively is that often their parents may not be in a financial situation to be able to support their education. And what that translates into is, of course, additional barriers for those children to be able to afford whatever forms of registration or school uniforms and things like this that in effect also hampers their efforts to go to school. And then we also know that in some instances, there is a sort of kind of situations where children, because of discrimination within maybe the school context, may be unable to register. So there are a number of overarching but also interconnected issues that prevents stateless children from accessing education.
Thank you for setting that out. And it's really important for these nexus areas to have a clear focus, because statelessness really is a global problem. It affects at least 15 million people around the world. And year on year, the problem is also growing because in many cases, stateless parents pass on their statelessness to children. And so children are born second, third, maybe fourth generation stateless. And when they struggle with these barriers to access education, then that impact also grows over time. And so given that it's a global issue and that a statelessness specific response is really needed to ensure that every child is able to go to school, you've been involved in coordinating a month of joined up action to draw attention to these issues and the need to pursue this specialist change. Could you tell us a bit more about this initiative? What were the key activities? How has it been going?
Sure. As you said, because we had identified this as an ongoing and a serious issue affecting stateless children, we thought it would be important to bring greater awareness to this challenge by bringing this issue to the global community. And using, through the work of our partners, we were able to bring together more than 10 organizations around the world who work with stateless children, and in some cases, organizations that don't work with stateless children. And it's been an incredible experience to bring together different types of community-based organizations and international and national organizations, as well as educational institutions to work with children in different ways to sort of bring their awareness to the issue, but also to bring that greater awareness to the global community. So we had amazing projects that were undertaken by partners all over the world that ranged from debate competitions in some places. In Kenya, for example, some of our partners worked with children to work on have debate competitions to talk about what the right to nationality and education mean. And then we also saw artistic performances, theatrical performances, art competitions, and as well partners who were able to develop podcasts and reports on their specific situation. So it was really an incredible opportunity to kind of bring together people across the world and showcase the diversity of this issue through working with different children in different countries everywhere.
Perfect. So there was an awful lot going on. And in order to give everyone who's watching this a bit of a flavor of what these projects look like, I believe you have a short video to show that captures some of the highlights from the projects and the partners in different parts of the world.
Yes, I would be happy to share that with you.
Perfect, thank you. So alongside all of these very colourful local activities, the Awareness Month also provided a means for people to raise their voices collectively on the issue. And part of it was about sharing a strong message with international actors, including human rights bodies based in Geneva. Could you tell us a bit about this aspect of the month? What were the aims and how did you pursue these?
Yeah, I mean, again, as I mentioned before, this is an issue that that requires more international attention, and we have tried different ways in which to engage the international community, including through those in Geneva, to bring greater awareness. At the start of this campaign, we convened an expert meeting with different actors, including the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education and others. And we've also been working hand in hand in some respects with the Committee on the Rights of the Child to also ensure that this is an issue that is more firmly placed on the agenda. I think it goes without saying that we have done a pretty good job in trying to demonstrate that although access to education is a right that is guaranteed for all children, that there is still a gap and there are some children who are being left behind, and those children include stateless children.
And maybe just kind of in summing up and reflecting on this experience and all of the different moving parts of it, perhaps you could say something about what is the change that you want to see? How do human rights frameworks like the Universal Declaration and the CRC Convention help as a guide star, and kind of what's next for this work?
Yeah, I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly articulates the right of every child to have a nationality. We also understand from the International Human Rights Framework that all children have a right to education. And what we would like to see coming out of this work going forward is that those sorts of standards are applied and include really stateless children to ensure that they have, as far as possible, the right to nationality, and also that they have better access and guarantees to education. I believe, we had developed an open letter that was geared toward the international community, to different UN agencies, to different treaty bodies who work on this issue, as well as different international stakeholders. And in terms of what we would like to see going forward is really, I think, a realization and an understanding that stateless children face very specific challenges to realize their right to education. And some of those challenges I outlined at the start of this interview. And so I suppose what would be important is that we continue this work to ensure that those specific challenges are known and understood by all relevant actors, so that they are able to respond and adapt their work in a way which that takes into account those challenges to ensure that stateless children, as well as other children, have access to education.
Thank you. Thanks, Deneisha, and thanks so much for joining. So yeah, there's a lot more that we could say about statelessness, about the right to nationality, about how this impacts also on other human rights. My organization is dedicated to working with stateless people and other allies to ensure that the right to nationality is respected worldwide. I hope that this interview, this presentation, gave you a bit of a flavor of the way in which we are trying to work with partners to bring human rights to life, both at the local level, but also joining that up with international advocacy and with work in Geneva. If you're interested in learning more, you're very welcome to visit our website of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And you can also find the open letter there that Deneisha was referring to, which remains open for signature through until the end of the year at least. Thanks so much for inviting us to be part of this event, and to everyone watching, enjoy the next contributions as well.